I'm Vanessa, 27 years old, and I still remember the exact moment my future sister-in-law screamed my name across a room full of 200 wedding guests, calling me a saboteur in front of both families gathered for the final rehearsal. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever been falsely blamed for something you never did, hit that like button and subscribe. This story is for you. You did this on purpose, Chloe shrieked, her wedding dress still pinned half-finished around her, tears streaking down her face as she pointed a shaking finger directly at me. You leaked the affair to ruin my wedding because you're jealous my life is finally coming together. I stood frozen near the altar, still holding the seating chart I'd been helping arrange, watching 200 confused faces turn toward me at once. My husband's family, Chloe's family, the wedding planner, even the priest, all of them staring as if I'd just been caught holding a smoking gun. "Chloe, I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, my voice barely audible over the rising murmur of the crowd. "Don't lie," she sobbed, gesturing wildly toward her fiancé, Marcus, my husband's younger brother, who stood pale and silent near the front pews, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "Someone sent screenshots to half our guest list an hour ago, proof that Marcus has been cheating. And you're the only person outside this family who knew anything private about us." My mother-in-law grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, her face contorted with fury I'd never seen directed at me before. "Get out," she hissed. "Get out of this church right now, before you ruin anything else." I looked at my husband, Daniel, standing just a few feet away, silent, his jaw tight, refusing to defend me even as I was dragged toward the door by his own mother. 200 people watched me get thrown out of mother-in-law's wedding rehearsal, branded as a jealous saboteur, without a single person asking me a single question about whether any of it was true. What none of them understood, not Chloe, not my mother-in-law, not even my own husband standing silently by, was that I had known about Marcus's affair for exactly 9 days, and I had never told a single soul. And in exactly 24 hours, the actual person Marcus had been cheating with was about to walk into that very wedding and reveal exactly who had really leaked the truth and why. I married Daniel 18 months ago, marrying not just him, but in the particular way large families operate, his entire close-knit clan, his parents, his younger brother Marcus, and Marcus's fiancée Chloe, who I'd only really gotten to know over the past year of engagement parties, dress fittings, and family dinners leading up to their wedding. Chloe was warm and effusive in a way that made her easy to like quickly, though I sometimes sensed, beneath her bright enthusiasm, a fragile need for everything around her to appear absolutely perfect. Marcus, by contrast, had always struck me as restless in a way Daniel's family seemed determined not to notice. He worked in real estate development, traveling frequently for site visits and client meetings, often for stretches of several days at a time, trips that had become an accepted, unremarkable part of family conversation by the time Chloe and Marcus' wedding planning began in earnest. 9 days before the rehearsal, I was working late at my graphic design studio when I received an unexpected message from a woman named Priya, someone I recognized vaguely as a college friend of Marcus's I'd met once years earlier at an unrelated gathering before Daniel and I were even dating. Her message was brief and clearly difficult for her to send. She had recently discovered, through a mutual friend, that Marcus had been seeing someone else consistently over the past several months, someone she happened to personally know from her own social circle, and she felt a moral obligation to let someone connected to the family know before the wedding proceeded. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at my phone, feeling a sick, spiraling uncertainty about what to do with information I had never asked for and desperately wished I didn't have. I didn't know Priya well enough to simply dismiss her as untrustworthy, but I also understood, immediately and viscerally, the impossible position I'd been placed in as a relatively new member of this family, someone whose loyalty and judgment were still, in many ways, being quietly evaluated by everyone around me. I told Daniel that same night, choosing him specifically because he was Marcus's older brother, someone with both the standing, and I believe, the responsibility to handle something this serious within the family rather than through outside interference. Daniel listened carefully, his expression darkening with each detail, before telling me he needed time to figure out how to approach it, asking me explicitly not to say anything to anyone else, including Chloe, until he'd had a chance to speak with Marcus directly. I agreed, trusting Daniel's judgment completely, believing we were handling this together, quietly and responsibly, exactly as any reasonable family would want a difficult truth handled before a wedding. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't understand until the chaos of the rehearsal 9 days later, was that Daniel's conversation with Marcus had gone very differently than I imagined, and that the two brothers had quietly agreed on an entirely different strategy than simply telling Chloe the truth. 3 days after I told Daniel about Priya's message, he came home late from what he described as grabbing drinks with Marcus, his expression unusually guarded as he moved around our kitchen avoiding my eyes. I talked to him, he said finally, not quite meeting my gaze. He says it's over, whatever it was. Some kind of temporary lapse in judgment before the wedding stress got to him. He swears it's completely done, and he's asked me not to tell Chloe because it would destroy her right before the wedding for no reason if it's already finished. I remember feeling deeply uneasy about that resolution, though I trusted Daniel's closer relationship with his brother, and I told myself, against a quiet, persistent doubt, that perhaps this really was simply a private matter the brothers needed to handle between themselves. I asked Daniel directly whether he believed Marcus, and he hesitated just long enough for me to notice before insisting that he did, that Marcus wouldn't lie about something this serious with his own wedding a week away. What I didn't know, and wouldn't discover until much later, was that Marcus had not, in fact, ended things with the woman Priya had mentioned, a woman named Sasha who worked as an interior designer and had been seeing Marcus consistently since shortly after his engagement to Chloe. Daniel's conversation with his brother had actually resulted in an entirely different kind of agreement, Marcus asking Daniel to simply keep quiet until after the wedding, promising he would figure things out properly once the immediate pressure of the ceremony had passed, a promise Daniel, out of some complicated mixture of brotherly loyalty and conflict avoidance, had quietly agreed to honor. I spent the following days trying to push my discomfort aside, focusing instead on the mounting logistics of the wedding itself, helping Chloe finalize seating arrangements and coordinate with vendors, watching her grow increasingly excited and stressed in equal measure as the ceremony approached. I felt a persistent, uncomfortable guilt every time she mentioned Marcus affectionately, every time she described how lucky she felt to have found someone so committed, knowing what I knew and having no clear path to tell her without breaking Daniel's explicit request. What none of us understood, not me, not Daniel, and certainly not Marcus, who believed he had successfully contained the situation, was that Sasha herself had not agreed to simply disappear quietly from Marcus's life once the wedding date arrived. Unbeknownst to any of us, Sasha had continued reaching out to Marcus over those final 9 days, increasingly frustrated by his repeated promises to handle things properly that never seemed to materialize into any actual conversation with Chloe. Sasha, it turned out, had her own network of connections within the same social circles Chloe moved through, connections that included, unbeknownst to any of us at the time, several mutual acquaintances, who would be attending the wedding rehearsal. Standing in that church the evening of the rehearsal, watching 200 confused faces turn to me the moment Chloe began screaming accusations, I had no idea that the actual leak, the screenshots that had spread through half the guest list within the hour, had come not from me, someone who had kept complete, careful silence for 9 agonizing days, but from Sasha herself, who had finally run out of patience waiting for a resolution Marcus had never intended to actually deliver. My mother-in-law's grip tightened around my arm as she pulled me toward the church doors, and I understood, with a sinking clarity, that I was about to be publicly blamed for a truth I had never told anyone, by a family that had never once considered asking me directly whether their assumption was even true. I sat alone in my car outside the church for nearly 20 minutes after being dragged out, my hands still shaking too badly to safely drive, replaying the scene over and over, trying to understand how 9 days of careful, painful silence had somehow transformed me into the villain of a story I had never actually participated in writing. Daniel hadn't followed me outside, nobody had. My best friend, Yuki, answered her phone on the second ring, her voice sharpening with alarm the moment she heard mine. "Vanessa, slow down. Tell me exactly what happened, from the beginning." I recounted everything as clearly as I could manage through the adrenaline still coursing through me. Priya's original message 9 days earlier, my conversation with Daniel, his insistence that Marcus had ended things, and simply needed time before telling Chloe, and now, somehow, screenshots circulating through the entire guest list that I had absolutely nothing to do with sending. "Do you still have Priya's original message?" Yuki asked, her tone shifting into the same careful, methodical focus I remembered from her years working as a paralegal before switching careers into corporate communications. I did. I had never deleted it, some instinct telling me, even at the time, that I might need proof someday of exactly what I had and hadn't done with information I never asked to receive. I forwarded the message to Yuki immediately, along with the timestamp showing I had responded only to Daniel, 9 days earlier, and had sent no further messages to anyone else about the situation since. "This timestamp is important," Yuki said. "If screenshots are circulating tonight, and your last communication about this entire situation was 9 days ago, sent privately only to your husband, that's a significant gap that doesn't support the story Chloe's currently telling everyone." Over the following hour, sitting in my car outside a church I had just been publicly thrown out of, Yuki helped me think through the situation with a clarity I couldn't have managed alone in that moment. She asked careful, specific questions about who else might have known about the affair, eventually landing on the detail I'd nearly forgotten in my panic. Priya had mentioned, in her original message, that she'd learned about the affair through a mutual friend who personally knew the other woman involved. "If there's a mutual friend circle around this other woman," Yuki said, "and she's the one who's been directly involved in the actual relationship, it's entirely possible the leak came from someone far closer to that side of the situation than from you. Vanessa, I think you need to find Priya again, tonight, and ask her directly whether she knows who might have finally decided to go public." I called Priya immediately, my hands still unsteady as I dialed a number I'd only used once before. She answered cautiously, clearly aware something significant had happened given the timing of my call. "Vanessa, I saw what's circulating," she said carefully. "I want you to know I never sent anything to anyone beyond that first message to you, 9 days ago. I've been genuinely worried about how this would unfold." "Priya, I believe you," I said, "but I need your help. Do you know who the other woman is? Do you know if she might have been the one who finally sent this out?" There was a long pause on the line before Priya answered, her voice quieter now, careful. "Her name is Sasha. I actually know her fairly well, and Vanessa, based on some things she said to me recently, I wouldn't be surprised at all if she finally reached her breaking point. Priya agreed to reach out to Sasha directly that same night, cautious but willing to help once she understood the full scope of what had happened at the rehearsal, and how completely the blame had landed on someone who had never actually broken her silence. She called me back less than an hour later, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and renewed frustration. I talked to her, Priya said. Vanessa, she confirmed it. She's the one who sent the screenshots tonight to about a dozen people in your extended socials circle, including a few who apparently knew each other well enough that it spread through the guest list within the hour. She said she'd been waiting for Marcus to actually tell Chloe the truth, like he kept promising, and when the rehearsal came and went with nothing changing, she finally decided she wasn't going to let the wedding happen while carrying that secret silently anymore. I felt something complicated settle over me, a strange mixture of vindication and continued frustration, understanding now exactly how the truth had actually spread, while also recognizing that proving this to Chloe's family, in the emotional chaos of the evening, would require more than simply my own account of events. Would Sasha be willing to say this directly, to Chloe or to the rest of the family? I asked, not to hurt anyone further, but simply so the truth is clear about where this actually came from. Priya hesitated. I think she might, actually. She sounded exhausted tonight, less angry and more just done carrying this alone. I get the sense she never wanted to hurt Chloe specifically. She wanted Marcus to stop lying to everyone, including her. Yuki, still on a separate call with me throughout this entire exchange, spoke up with the same careful, strategic focus she'd brought to the conversation from the beginning. Vanessa, I think the most important thing right now isn't confronting anyone tonight, while everyone's emotions are still at their highest. The wedding is tomorrow. If Chloe's family is going to accept the truth about what actually happened, it needs to come from a calm, clear moment, not from you trying to argue your case in the middle of more chaos. I thought about that carefully, understanding the wisdom in it even through my own residual anger at being so publicly, unfairly blamed. What do you think I should do? I think, Yuki said slowly, you reach out to Sasha directly tonight and ask her honestly whether she'd be willing to clarify things tomorrow, at the wedding itself, in front of the same people who watched you get thrown out today. Not to sabotage Chloe's day further, but because the truth deserves the same audience the accusation was given. I called Sasha directly an hour later, my voice careful and measured despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of me. She answered quietly, clearly expecting the call after her conversation with Priya. I owe you an apology, she said before I could say much of anything. I had no idea you'd get blamed for this. I just couldn't keep watching him lie to everyone anymore, and I didn't think through who else might get hurt by finally telling the truth. I understand why you did it, I said honestly, but Sasha, I need your help clearing my name tomorrow, in front of the same people who blamed me tonight. Would you be willing to do that? There was a long pause before she answered, her voice steadier now, resolved. Yes. I think I owe both of us that much. I didn't sleep at all that night, lying awake beside Daniel, who had come home hours after the rehearsal without offering a single word of explanation or apology for his silence while his mother dragged me out of the church. We didn't speak about it directly, both of us apparently too exhausted and too uncertain of what to say, though I understood, with a growing clarity, that whatever remained unresolved between us would need to be addressed regardless of how the wedding itself unfolded. Yuki called me early the next morning, her voice steady and focused, despite the early hour. I want to make sure we approach today carefully, she said. If Sasha shows up unannounced and simply starts talking in the middle of the ceremony, it could look chaotic, even manipulative, no matter how true what she's saying actually is. We need this to happen at the right moment, calmly, with enough context that everyone understands exactly what they're hearing and why. I agreed completely, understanding that the wedding itself was still, despite everything, deeply important to 200 people who had no idea about any of the private turmoil unfolding beneath the surface. I didn't want to destroy Chloe's day out of anger. I wanted, simply and specifically, for the truth about my own innocence to finally be understood by people who had judged me without ever asking a single question. Priya, coordinating quietly between Sasha and me throughout the morning, suggested a specific plan. Rather than Sasha interrupting the ceremony itself, she would arrive early, before the wedding began, and speak privately first with Chloe's parents and my in-laws, giving them the opportunity to understand the full truth before any guests arrived, allowing the family to decide themselves how, or whether, to proceed with the day, armed finally with accurate information rather than assumptions. This isn't about revenge, Priya reminded me during our final call before the wedding. Sasha isn't doing this to hurt Chloe further. She's doing it because you were blamed for something you never did, and because Marcus has been lying to everyone, including her, for months. I arrived at the venue that afternoon dressed carefully, deliberately composed despite the exhaustion and anxiety still churning beneath the surface. Daniel drove separately, having left our house early that morning without much explanation, and I found myself, standing outside the venue, uncertain whether he even knew what was about to unfold, or whether he and Marcus had continued their own private conversation about how to manage the fallout from the rehearsal. Sasha arrived 20 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, dressed simply, clearly nervous but resolved, exactly as Priya had described her on the phone the night before. She found me near the entrance, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other, two women who had never met before that day, both having been pulled into a situation neither of us had asked to be part of. "Thank you for being willing to do this," I said quietly. "Thank you for not hating me for how messy this got," she replied, her voice steadier than I expected. "Let's go find Chloe's parents before the guests start arriving. I want this handled as calmly and privately as possible." We walked together toward the small private room, where I knew the immediate family was gathering, both of us aware that whatever happened in the next 20 minutes would determine not just whether the wedding proceeded, but whether the truth about that rehearsal would finally be understood by everyone who had watched me dragged out the night before. The private room was smaller than I expected, tucked behind the main ceremony space, filled with the nervous energy of a family preparing for what they still believed would be a joyful day. Chloe sat near the window in her wedding dress, her makeup artist carefully finishing final touches, while my mother-in-law fussed over floral arrangements nearby. Marcus stood near the door in his suit, and the moment his eyes landed on Sasha walking in beside me, every ounce of color drained from his face. "What is she doing here?" he said, his voice cracking with panic loud enough that Chloe turned immediately from the mirror, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she recognized something significant was happening. "Marcus," Sasha said quietly, her voice steady despite the visible nervousness in her hands, "I think it's time everyone in this room heard the truth, before this wedding goes any further." Chloe stood slowly from her chair, her wedding dress rustling in the sudden silence. "I don't understand. Who are you?" "My name is Sasha," she said, meeting Chloe's gaze directly. "I've been seeing Marcus for the past several months. He told me repeatedly he was going to end things properly and tell you the truth before the wedding. When that never happened, and I watched Vanessa get blamed last night for something she had nothing to do with, I couldn't stay silent anymore. The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. My mother-in-law's hand froze mid-motion over the flower arrangement, her face slowly shifting from confusion to horrified realization. Chloe's father, standing near the door, stepped forward with the same protective urgency I imagined he'd carried through every difficult moment of his daughter's life. "Marcus," Chloe said, her voice trembling, "is this true?" Marcus opened his mouth, glancing desperately toward Daniel, who had just entered the room and stopped abruptly in the doorway, taking in the scene with visible shock. "Chloe, I can explain." "You told me it was over," Chloe said, her voice rising now, sharp with a pain that cut through the earlier confusion entirely. "You told me a week ago that whatever this was, it was completely finished." "It was supposed to be," Marcus said weakly, his composure collapsing entirely under the weight of the room's attention. "I was going to end it properly, I just needed the right timing." "The right timing was before you proposed to me," Chloe said, tears now streaming freely down her carefully applied makeup. She turned toward me then, her expression shifting from anger into something closer to horrified guilt. "Vanessa, I threw you out of my rehearsal last night. I called you a saboteur in front of 200 people." "You did," I said quietly, not with cruelty, but simply with the exhausted honesty of someone who had spent an entire sleepless night waiting for this exact moment. "I knew about the affair 9 days ago. I told Daniel, and only Daniel, because I trusted him to handle it responsibly within the family. I never told another soul." Daniel stepped further into the room now, his face pale, clearly beginning to understand the full weight of the silence he had asked me to keep, and the public consequences it had ultimately cost me. "Chloe, Vanessa's telling the truth," he said quietly. "Marcus told me he'd ended it." I believed him. I asked Vanessa not to say anything until we figured out the right way to handle it. Chloe turned back toward Marcus, her wedding dress suddenly looking less like a celebration and more like a costume for a role she was no longer willing to play. "So you lied to me. Your family knew and said nothing. And an innocent woman got dragged out of my rehearsal for something none of you actually had the courage to admit yourselves." Chloe stood motionless for a long moment, staring at Marcus with an expression that had shifted entirely from grief into something colder, more resolved. The room remained silent, everyone waiting, unwilling to be the first to speak into the wreckage unfolding in front of them. "I need everyone except Vanessa to leave this room," Chloe said finally, her voice steadier than I expected given everything unfolding around her. "Right now." My mother-in-law hesitated, clearly wanting to intervene, to smooth over what was rapidly becoming an unsalvageable situation for her younger son. "Chloe, sweetheart, perhaps we should discuss this calmly, without any rash decisions." "I said everyone except Vanessa," Chloe repeated, her voice sharper now, carrying an authority I hadn't heard from her before in the months I'd known her. "That includes you, Diane. I think this family has made enough decisions on my behalf without consulting me directly." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but Chloe's father placed a firm hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the door with an expression that made clear no further discussion would be entertained in that moment. Daniel lingered a moment longer, glancing at me with something that looked almost like an apology forming, before he too stepped out, leaving Sasha, Chloe, and me alone in the small, quiet room. Chloe sat down slowly on the edge of a nearby chair, her wedding dress pooling around her, looking suddenly much younger than the confident, excited bride I'd watched planning centerpieces just weeks earlier. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, looking directly at me for the first time since Sasha's revelation. "I threw you out of my rehearsal in front of everyone I know. I called you jealous. I never once considered that maybe I should have asked you directly what actually happened before deciding you were the villain." "You were scared and hurt," I said honestly, feeling none of the anger I'd expected to still be carrying into this conversation. "I understand why it felt easier to believe I was the problem, rather than believing Marcus had been lying to you for months." Sasha, still standing near the doorway, spoke quietly. "For what it's worth, Chloe, I never wanted to hurt you specifically. I just couldn't keep watching him lie to both of us anymore, waiting for a conversation he clearly never intended to actually have." Chloe nodded slowly, wiping carefully at her eyes to avoid smudging her makeup entirely, a small, almost involuntary gesture that revealed how deeply the wedding day logistics were still, even now, running through her mind. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "There are 200 guests arriving in less than an hour." "That's your decision to make," I said gently. "Nobody in this room is going to tell you what the right choice is today. But whatever you decide, Chloe, I need you to understand that I never did anything to sabotage your wedding. I carried a secret I never asked for 9 days, because I trusted your future husband's own brother to handle it responsibly. That trust turned out to be badly misplaced, but it was never malicious." Chloe reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly firm despite everything unraveling around her. "I know that now, and I'm going to make sure everyone out there knows it too, before this day goes any further." Chloe stood slowly, smoothing the front of her wedding dress with a steadiness that surprised even me, given everything that had unraveled in the past 20 minutes. "I need to speak to my guests," she said, her voice carrying a quiet resolve that hadn't been there when we first walked into that room. "All of them, before the ceremony starts, or doesn't." Sasha touched her arm gently. "Chloe, you don't owe anyone a public explanation. This is your day. You can handle this privately, however you want." "I disagree," Chloe said. "Vanessa was publicly humiliated in front of everyone at that rehearsal. If I let this stay behind closed doors now, half those guests will spend today whispering rumors about her that were never true to begin with. I'm not going to let that happen, whatever else happens with my wedding." We walked together toward the main ceremony space, where the string quartet had already begun a soft prelude, guests settling into white folding chairs beneath a floral arch that had taken the wedding planner weeks to design. Chloe walked to the front of the aisle, her father beside her, and raised a hand for quiet, the musicians gradually falling silent as 200 confused faces turned toward her. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Chloe began, her voice carrying clearly across the outdoor venue, despite its slight tremor. "But before anything else happens, I need to correct something that happened at last night's rehearsal, something that was deeply unfair to someone in this family." A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the guests. Marcus stood near the front, pale and silent, while my mother-in-law sat rigidly beside him, her expression unreadable. "Last night, my future sister-in-law, Vanessa, was accused publicly of leaking private information about my relationship in order to sabotage this wedding," Chloe continued. "That accusation was false. Vanessa knew about a difficult situation involving Marcus for exactly 9 days, and she told no one except her own husband, trusting our family to handle it responsibly. She kept that secret at real personal cost to herself, and she was punished publicly for someone else's choices." The murmuring grew louder now, guests exchanging uncertain glances, several turning to look at me where I stood near the edge of the aisle beside Sasha. Chloe took a breath, steadying herself before continuing. The truth is more complicated and more painful than any of us expected to be discussing today, but I refuse to let an innocent woman carry the blame for a situation she did everything right in handling. She paused, glancing briefly at Marcus, her expression hardening slightly. As for the rest of today, I need some time to decide what happens next, but I wanted every single person here to know clearly that Vanessa did absolutely nothing wrong. A few guests began clapping softly, uncertain but supportive, the sound spreading gradually through the seated rows. My mother-in-law's face had gone pale, her earlier fury from the previous night replaced by something closer to visible shame. Daniel found my eyes across the crowd, and for the first time since the entire ordeal began, I saw something in his expression that looked genuinely, painfully apologetic. Chloe turned to her wedding planner, speaking quietly for a moment before addressing the crowd one final time. Today's ceremony is postponed. I need time, and honestly, so does my family. Thank you all for understanding. As guests began rising uncertainly from their seats, murmuring amongst themselves, Chloe walked directly toward me, pulling me into an unexpected, tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have believed in you from the very beginning." The wedding never rescheduled. Chloe called off her engagement to Marcus within a week, choosing, she told me later over coffee, to spend time understanding exactly who she wanted to be rather than rushing back into a relationship built on months of quiet lies. She moved out of the apartment she'd shared with Marcus and back in with her parents temporarily, giving herself the space she said she'd never actually allowed herself during the whirlwind of wedding planning. Marcus attempted, over the following months, to repair things with Chloe, sending messages she rarely responded to, showing up unannounced at family gatherings he was no longer entirely welcome at. He and Sasha never rekindled anything either, both of them, it seemed, exhausted by a situation neither had fully chosen for themselves. I heard, through occasional family updates, that he eventually relocated to a different city for work, distancing himself from a family dynamic that had grown considerably more complicated since that rehearsal. My mother-in-law never fully apologized to me directly, though her behavior shifted noticeably in the months following the canceled wedding, a careful, deliberate warmth replacing the sharp suspicion she'd once treated me with. I understood, without either of us ever discussing it explicitly, that the public humiliation of watching her own certainty proven so completely wrong had left its own quiet mark on her. Daniel and I spent several difficult months working through what his silence, his willingness to protect his brother's secret at my expense, had actually revealed about the choices he made under pressure. We attended a handful of counseling sessions together, conversations that felt uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure, slowly rebuilding a version of trust that acknowledged, honestly, how badly that trust had been damaged by his decision to prioritize Marcus's timeline over my public reputation. Sasha and I, unexpectedly, remained in occasional contact after everything settled, two women who had been thrown together by circumstances neither of us asked for, bonded by the strange, specific experience of watching a family's carefully maintained image collapse in real time. She eventually moved forward with her own life, dating someone entirely unconnected to the entire situation, though she told me once, over a brief coffee months later, that she never regretted finally telling the truth, whatever chaos it caused that particular week. Chloe and I grew closer in the months following the canceled wedding, an unlikely friendship built from the specific, unusual solidarity of two women who had both been badly misled by the same family's careful silence. She eventually met someone new, someone she introduced me to nearly a year later with a lightness and confidence I hadn't seen in her since before the wedding chaos began. I think about that rehearsal night sometimes, standing frozen at the altar while 200 people watched me get dragged toward the door, branded as a saboteur for a truth I had never told. What I understand now, in a way I couldn't fully grasp in that terrifying moment, is that silence carries its own particular weight, and sometimes, the people who ask you to carry it are the very people least prepared to acknowledge what that silence eventually costs you. 2 years have passed since I stood frozen near that altar, listening to Chloe scream accusations I never deserved in front of 200 stunned wedding guests. Daniel and I remain married, though our relationship today looks considerably different than it did before that rehearsal, built now on a foundation that includes honest, sometimes uncomfortable conversations neither of us used to know how to have with each other. Marcus reached out to me directly once, nearly a year after everything unraveled, offering an apology that felt, finally, genuine rather than strategic. I accepted it carefully, understanding that forgiveness didn't require forgetting exactly how easily he'd allowed me to absorb consequences that were never mine to carry. We remain cordial at family gatherings now, though the easy warmth we once shared as in-laws never fully returned, and I've made peace with that particular loss. My mother-in-law and I built something closer to genuine respect over these past 2 years. A relationship earned slowly through consistent honesty, rather than the cautious politeness that once defined our interactions. She told me once, during a quiet conversation over the holidays, that watching her own certainty proven so completely wrong that night had taught her more about listening carefully before judging than any other moment in her life. Chloe married her new partner last spring, a quiet, thoughtful man who treats her, from everything I've witnessed, with exactly the kind of honesty she once assumed wrongly that Marcus had been offering her all along. I attended the wedding as one of her closest friends, an unlikely outcome from a story that began with her dragging me out of her own rehearsal in front of everyone she knew. Sasha and I still exchange occasional messages, two women bound together by an unusual, specific history neither of us anticipated sharing. She told me recently that she still thinks sometimes about the exact moment she finally decided to send those screenshots, understanding now, with some distance, both the chaos it caused and the necessity of finally ending months of quiet deception. I think about that rehearsal far less often now than I once did, and when I do, it arrives with something closer to quiet clarity than lingering pain. Being falsely blamed for something you never did teaches you, eventually, that the truth doesn't always announce itself immediately, loudly, or on your own timeline. Sometimes it simply requires enough patience, and enough people finally willing to speak honestly, for the full picture to emerge exactly when it needs to. I am not the woman that Rehearsal once tried to define as a jealous saboteur. I never was. I was simply someone who carried a secret responsibly, at real personal cost, until the truth finally found its own way into the light. If you've ever been falsely blamed for something you never did, only to be vindicated later, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this journey meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one.